Welcome back to One Up the Annals, where shame becomes legend and history gets filed under restricted access. Tonight, 50 Shades of Data. Kinsey, the pervert with a clipboard. I am your host, the keeper of questionable entries, the bug man of bad ideas, the collector of every secret you never wanted to read aloud. And tonight, we'll unseal the cabinets, because this isn't just any scroll. This is the story of Alfred Kinsey, the wasp pin collector who turned into America's archivist of desire. The man who measured sins like specimens, who turned bedrooms into ledgers, orgasms into percentages, and built an empire of shame one confession at a time. He wanted to prove that no lust was unique, that no shame was solitary, and for that, he became the most hated, most hounded, most haunted scientist in America. So pull up a chair, dim the lights, and get ready to stare into the mirror he forced America to face. Now a quick Kinsey disclaimer before we pin this bug to the board. The annals are for entertainment only. Yes, Alfred Kinsey was real. His research was real. His scandals very real. But this is not your grandmother's science lecture. We'll be leaning into the rumors, the accusations, and the filthiest footnotes. If you're writing a dissertation, cite Kinsey himself. If you're listening here, congratulations, you've just unrolled America's dirtiest science class. Kinsey poked his clipboard into every corner of human lust. From farm boys to forbidden bedrooms. Some of it's funny, some of it's filthy, and some of it's so dark it makes us even wince. So buckle in, because if America had a sexual basement, Kinsey was down there cataloging the boxes. Still with us? Good. Let's go. Act 1. The Boy Who Counted Worms. Alfred Kinsey was born in Hoboken in 1894, in a house where joy had to knock before entering. And most nights it wasn't let in. His father, Alfred Sr., was a Methodist tyrant with a preacher's voice and a jailer's hand. He believed pleasure softened men, that laughter cracked the armor of righteousness. At the dinner table, words like leg or pregnant were forbidden, as if syllables themselves could seduce. The house carried it in the air. Windows shuttered early, curtains drawn against the neighbors. Clara, Alfred's future wife, would later recall how the family atmosphere hung like a damp cloth, suffocating, joyless, repressing every instinct toward play or intimacy. Even the wallpaper seemed pious, blank and brown as if color itself was sinful. And little Alfred Jr.? He was born into a body that betrayed him. Rickets bent his spine. Rheumatic fever scarred his heart. Typhoid nearly killed him. Other boys ran bases in the summer heat. Kinsey limped frail and pale, mocked for his awkward gait, teased for the way he hunched when he walked. His classmates called him wormy, sneered that he couldn't throw a ball, couldn't climb a rope, couldn't man up. So he retreated into the dirt, into crawl spaces where shame couldn't reach. He turned his attention to bugs, and then to wasps. Bent double in weeds, he captured them with nets, pinned them with precision, measured every fraction of a wing. Over the years, he collected more than 7 million gall wasps. 7 million! Drawer after drawer, cabinet after cabinet, his empire of corpses now sits in the American Museum of Natural History, the grandest tomb ever built for insects. Childhood wasn't play for him, it was surveillance. The boy who couldn't control his body controlled the world under glass. But even in the dirt, battles raged under his skin. His adolescence became a labyrinth of fear and longing. While other boys fumbled with their first kisses, Kinsey wrestled with urges he didn't understand. He dreamed of being bound, punished, humiliated. Masochistic fantasies spiraled in his mind. He wondered if he was broken, defective, cursed. His father thundered that purity was the only shield from hell. Kinsey wondered if his very flesh was already damned. He reached adulthood a virgin, Never once on a date with a woman, never once in a bed. The repression was complete now. So when he finally met Clara in 1920, he carried into marriage not just shyness, but decades of guilt, confusion, and the gnawing belief that his body was a crime scene. That wound never healed. It became his compass. Every statistic he gathered, every interview, every attic reel was his way of proving the thing he couldn't shake, that he wasn't alone. That all those fantasies, all that confusion, all the shame that chewed at him were not just his. They were human, universal. By 1938, Indiana University handed him a marriage course. Kinsey saw not just a teaching assignment, but a laboratory. A chance to put his wound to work. He leafed through the textbooks and saw nothing but sanctimonious lies. His students wanted truth. He knew where to find it. So he built his net, the 350-question codebook, memorized by interviewers, indecipherable to outsiders. Every act, every secret, every deviation plotted like a map of shame. Have you cheated? Which position? Did you orgasm? Did you touch an animal, a cousin, a stranger in a public stall? Nothing was too dark to lock, and I mean nothing. And then the attic. His own life became data. Kinsey, his staff, Pomeroy, Martin, Gebhardt, and Clara filmed themselves and each other under hot lights. 16mm reels whirring. Not for pleasure, but for desensitization, for practice, for science. Clara took lovers from the team, and Alfred interviewed them after, recording their details, filing them into his growing archive. Their marriage wasn't simply open, it was another experiment, another ledger entry. The boy who once pinned wasp now pinned orgasms. Sex wasn't sin, it wasn't even pleasure, it was raw material. And when sexual behavior in the human male landed in 1948, it wasn't just a book, it was a bomb. America's mirror held up by the boy who had once believed himself damned. Act 2, the reports explode. America was shiny with post-war triumph, fathers in fedoras, mothers in pearls, children saluting flags in tidy suburban schools. Life magazine smiles gleamed from every cover. Pulpits thundered about purity, and the nation congratulated itself for being the model of virtue. And then Alfred Kinsey dropped his book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. 800 pages, thick as a brick, filled with charts, tables, and percentages. Not a sermon, not a moral, just the raw, unflinching math of desire. And the numbers hit like artillery. 37% of men confess to at least one homosexual encounter to orgasm. 92% admitted to masturbation. Half to adultery. 1 in 8 to paying prostitutes. America's Norman Rockwell fantasy burst like wet paper. The city on a hill was a carnival of lust, but numbers alone don't tell it. Kinsey's interviews were mosaics of confession, and some were shocking even to him. One man admitted his first orgasm came not with a woman, not even with a man, but at the sight of horses being bred on his family farm. A businessman confessed he carried on 2 double lives at once, a wife and a mistress in Indianapolis, and a companion waiting for him in Chicago. A farmer described matter-of-factly how every boy on the farm knew animals before he knew girls. These weren't pornographic fantasies. These were real America, whispered in coded rooms, scrawled into Kinsey's ledgers. Kinsey wasn't just cataloging the public. He was bending his own inner circle to the archive, too. His staff weren't just researchers. They were disciples. Pomeroy, Martin, Gebhardt, men bound by secrecy and loyalty, driven by Kinsey's obsession. He encouraged them to sleep with one another, with their wives, and sometimes with him. Clyde Martin was the starkest example, a young student when Kinsey noticed him. Martin was drawn into an affair, persuaded by Kinsey's authority as professor, as mentor, as employer. Kinsey framed it as desensitization, science in action, but the truth was darker. The archivist seducing his assistant, filing him into the ledger. Kinsey didn't just collect data, he arranged it, manipulating his team like wasps, pinned into place. And Kinsey's archive wasn't limited to confessions. His Bloomington home swelled with erotica from around the globe. Manuscripts, photographs, reels, drawings. Customs officials seized shipments at ports, tried to prosecute him for obscenity. Kinsey fought back, though, insisting it was all for science. In his basement, he built one of the world's largest pornography libraries. Not to leer at it, but to preserve it. He was the ultimate voyeur, amassing humanity's secret urges in drawers, cabinets, and film reels. When the mail volume landed, the country detonated. Pastors thundered from pulpits, branding Kinsey corrupter of morals. Politicians muttered about obscenity. Hoover's FBI opened a file, convinced a man who tabulated sodomy and adultery was a national security threat. To them, a scientist counting blowjobs looked like a communist grenade rolled under the bed. And yet the book sold like sin, 200,000 copies in 2 months. Sold out in bookstores, passed hand to hand like contraband. Pastors who damned it on Sunday read it by lamplight Monday night. Even Good Housekeeping tipped its hat. The book didn't just sell, it seeped into culture. A Miami Playboy bought 50 copies to mail to every woman he'd ever courted. A Harvard student, drinking song, declared, "I've looked you up in the Kinsey report, and you're just the man for me." Letters flooded Kinsey's desk, some furious, some grateful. One woman wrote that his book saved her marriage. Another begged him to confirm her teenage son's habits weren't sending him to hell. Universities whispered of scandal when students smuggled the volume into dormitories, reading it aloud in hushed midnight circles. And then came 1953. The sexual behavior in the human female. If the male report cracked the mask, the female report tore it off and stomped on it, in heels. Kinsey revealed what America didn't want to hear. Women masturbated. Women had premarital sex. Women cheated. And the most blasphemous of all, women enjoyed it. It was dynamite and pearls. For centuries, women were written as vessels of virtue. Kinsey's tables revealed them as flesh and blood, as hungry as men, as human as anyone in his ledgers. The backlash was volcanic. Clergy branded him Satan's statistician. Bishops warned civilization itself was at stake. Politicians shrieked obscenity even as they slipped copies into desk drawers. Hoover's FBI swelled Kinsey's file. And somehow in the middle of all this, critics found something darker in his data. Buried in the tables were entries on children. Responses, orgasms, charts that looked even then like dynamite. At the time, most ignored it. Decades later, crusaders would accuse Kinsey of criminal complicity, of supervising molestation. Whether true or not, the fuse was lit. I read that as fast as I could, and now I'm moving on. Kinsey stood at lecterns before thousands, clicking through slides, speaking the forbidden words. Masturbation, homosexuality, orgasm. Audiences gasped, some scandalized, others relieved. They didn't come to learn, they came to confess, to confirm they weren't alone, to bask in the relief that their secret sin was shared. And this was the secret genius of Kinsey's lust. He didn't seduce America into these acts. America was already doing them. He archived it. He built ledgers and grids to contain what no one else dared to name. He turned every hidden act into a pinned specimen, every confession into a wasp under glass. And the nation, horrified and addicted, could not look away. Act 3, the fallout and the hypocrisy. Alfred Kinsey thought the truth would free America, that by proving its lusts were universal, he'd finally lift the weight of shame. Instead, the more he published, the tighter the noose drew around him. At first, the money flowed. Quiet Rockefeller checks funneled through the National Research Council gave his little sex lab the lifeblood it needed. $40,000 a year by 1947. More than enough to keep reels spinning, interviewers traveling, the archive swelling. But when sexual behavior in the human female detonated in 1953, the heat became unbearable. Congress sniffed around, bishops spat fire, Rockefeller executives began to sweat. They drafted letters that sounded polite on the surface, but read like icy breakup notes. One board member called Kinsey's work a dangerous contamination of our reputation. Another warned of public scandal on a great magnitude. By 1954, the spigot snapped shut. Overnight, the lab that had cataloged America's secret life was broke. The fluorescent lights still buzzed, the filing cabinets still bulged with coded sins, but the money was gone. And while the Foundation washed its hands, the government sharpened its knives. Hoover's FBI kept a thick file on Kinsey. The memos spoke in code but dripped with fear. Subjects' research into sexual perversions represent potential security liability, it read. Unwholesome activities may compromise moral fiber of the nation. Hoover himself scrawled notes in the margins, circling Kinsey's name with the same venom he reserved for civil rights leaders and suspected communists. To Hoover, perversion was weakness, and weakness was treason. So while Kinsey built his archive of desire, the FBI built an archive of him. Surveillance reports, whispered suspicions, a counter-ledger cataloging his sins. Two archives staring at each other across a chasm of paranoia. The clergy weren't far behind. Ministries roared from pulpits, calling Kinsey the devil's clerk with a clipboard. They thundered that his books weren't science but Satan's handbook. They couldn't stand that their flocks were sinners by the numbers. They needed shame to rule. Kinsey had robbed them of it with charts and percentages. So like cornered beasts, they howled. Politicians too, they spewed bile on the Senate floor, crying corruption and moral collapse. Then slipped out of town to chase their mistresses. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on. Every chart Kinsey published seemed to be confirmed by the very men who condemned him. But the most devastating theater wasn't in Congress or the pulpits. It was in Kinsey's own body. The observer had always been a participant. From his youth, he had carried masochistic fantasies, troubled obsessions, confusion over his own desires. In middle age, he gave them form. He tied himself up, documenting his own fetishes with the same clinical detachment he used on farm boys and housewives. And then came the most grotesque experiment of all. Kinsey tried self-infibulation, forcing a metal ring through the foreskin of his penis, fastening it tight in a crude imitation of ancient practices. He performed it in secret, charting his pain as though it were another case study. But flesh isn't theory. He tore himself open. The wound festered, infected, nearly killed him. And still, he treated it as data. He wasn't just recording America's wounds, he was carving them into himself. The archivist of lust became his own specimen, proving that no desire, no matter how extreme, fell outside the human spectrum. And Clara, faithful, complicit Clara, remained his mirror and accomplice. She took lovers within his circle, fed his archive with her affairs. She sat for interviews, answered the same coded questions he asked strangers. Some saw her as liberated, a willing co-conspirator. Others pitied her, as a woman trapped in her husband's obsession, sacrificed on the altar of science. History never decided, but the ledger contains her fingerprints as much as his. Kinsey never stopped, even as his kidneys failed, even as pain gnawed his body. He kept defending his numbers, defending his archive, defending the belief that data could wash away shame. He lectured until his voice gave out, cataloged until his hands shook too much to write. By 1956, the strain crushed him. His heart faltered. The man who cataloged millions of orgasms collapsed at 62, his body as worn out as his reputation. The boy who once measured wasps, the man who measured sins, ended up measured himself. Pinned, dissected, condemned by a country that could never forgive him for telling the truth. Act 4. The War That Never Ended. Alfred Kinsey's body gave out in 1956, but his archive did not die with him. His 2 volumes lived on like toxic scripture, impossible to burn, impossible to bury, glowing with the heat of secrets no one wanted but everyone read. In universities, his work became a gateway drug. Without Kinsey, there'd be no Masters and Johnson in the 1960s, timing orgasms with stopwatches. No glossy joy of sex manuals stacked in suburban nightstands. No language of modern therapy for desire and orientation. The sexual revolution didn't start with Woodstock. It started with Kinsey's charts. He cracked the lock, and the revolution marched right through. But as quickly as the revolution claimed him, the counter-revolution sharpened its knives. By the 1980s, America was deep in Reagan's family values crusade. Into the storm strode Judith Reisman, wielding Kinsey's name like a weapon. She called him a fraud, a pervert, a pedophile. On talk shows and courtrooms at conferences, she held up his tables on child sexual responses as proof of depravity. Where Kinsey had logged one pedophile's meticulous diaries, Reisman insisted Kinsey himself was complicit, that he had supervised the abuse of hundreds of children, that he saw screaming and weeping not as agony but as orgasm. The Kinsey Institute denied it. Biographer James H. Jones rejected the charge outright. Later, directors swore no child had ever been touched by Kinsey or his staff. But by then, truth didn't matter. The accusations fit the zeitgeist. The Reagan-era right had its devil, and Kinsey's name became shorthand for everything wrong with modern sexuality. His ghost was dragged into debates over pornography, homosexuality, even AIDS. Reisman's crusade fused him forever to America's moral panic. And the archive itself kept giving critics ammunition. Kinsey's basement had been filled with imported erotica, seized and challenged by customs in his lifetime. Thousands of photos, reels, manuscripts. To defenders it was preservation, to enemies it was evidence of obsession. A porn library with a university stamp. So Kinsey's ghost lingered. He haunted pulpits and legislatures. In Indiana, his own home turf, lawmakers have tried again and again to defund the Kinsey Institute, citing scandals from 70 years ago as if they were fresh. In 2023, one legislator thundered, "Not one more tax dollar should go to this cesspool." Another declared the Institute a monument of corruption. Imagine that, a man nearly 7 decades dead, still on trial in his own state house. Even the occult claimed him. In 1955, near the end of his life, Kinsey traveled with experimental filmmaker Kenneth Anger to Sicily, to Aleister Crowley's infamous Abbey of Thelema. Its walls still bore faded murals of orgies and rituals. Anger later described Kinsey with reverence, not scandalized, not aroused, but fascinated. The Bugman of Bloomington stood in the sex temple of the beast himself, sketching notes, measuring the remnants of ritual like he once measured wasp wings. 2 archivists, Crowley of the occult, Kinsey of desire, brushing shoulders against oceans and decades. Hollywood tried to polish him. In 2004, Liam Neeson played him in Kinsey, turning the Bugman into a tortured humanist. Documentaries like Kinsey, Let's Talk About Sex revisited his data. He's been referenced in TV sitcoms and stand-up routines and music. Jokes about the Kinsey scale turned his research into shorthand for fluid desire. Even today, college kids whisper his name when they stumble across the old charts online, gaping at numbers that still feel shocking. And yet outside the theaters, the war rages on. Conspiracists paint him as the architect of moral decay. Activists call him the father of liberation. Pastors still hiss his name. Politicians still try to erase his legacy. And here's the irony carved in stone. Alfred Kinsey's own lusts were narrow, obsessive, tortured. He didn't live most of the acts he logged. His kink was counting. He lusted for the archive. He measured what others were too ashamed to admit. So the question is left for us. Who was the real deviant? Kinsey, who recorded it? Or America, who did it? He was the mirror holder, the archivist of desire, and he ended up the one nailed to the wall, pinned forever, a wasp in history's jar. So here we are, at the end of the archive. Alfred Kinsey spent his life counting sins he barely committed, turning desire into decimals, lust into ledgers. His kink was counting, his passion was preservation. And America? America was the one sneaking into barns, fumbling in basements, cheating in hotel rooms, confessing to him in whispers. He didn't corrupt the country. The country confessed to him. So who is the real deviant? The Bugman with a clipboard, or the nation that filled it with filth? That's the versus tonight. Kinsey versus America. The archivist versus the archive. The man who measured versus the people who gave him something to measure. I'll let you decide who deserves the crown of shame. Where shame becomes legend, Tonight, we've unspooled the reels, cracked open the cabinets, and stared into a mirror America tried to shatter. Kinsey, the pervert with a clipboard, proved that behind every pulpit and picket fence, there was already a carnival of lust. I came for the facts, you stayed for the filth, and now it's in the annals. If you survived this syllabus of sin, make some noise. Follow, subscribe, review, and join us for more of history's back-end disasters, because the archive never closes, and the next confession is already waiting. Good night.